Elections everywhere, not Israel, but all over the world, and particularly where I am right now. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. You know what, Jonathan, after 3.5 years, I'm poised to say something that might make you, I don't know, never talk to me again, but I'm going to take that chance.
Okay, it's a risk.
I can see you sitting down and bracing yourself. I think Netanyahu might be right. Can I explain?
I'm stunned silence, but go on, yes.
See,
tell me why.
There's one constant in the chaos that is our lives, is that the modus operandi of the Israeli prime minister is to delay, and delay, right? Never do anything earlier than you should, postpone, play the waiting game, kick the can down the road, never initiate, and don't do anything prematurely, right? This is his ideology, live to see another political day. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I'm looking around me, you say elections everywhere. I'm looking at, Mr. Macron, who decided to go to early parliamentary elections, or Rishi Sunak this day, elections in the UK. We'll talk about that, of course, at length, deciding on early general elections, or Joe Biden deciding on going to an early debate. The opposite of Benjamin Netanyahu's ideology. Look where they all are today. That's what I wanted to say.
I think it is such a good point. I'm going to shock you. I completely agree with you. And by the way, that shouldn't be so shocking, because even though I oppose and disapprove of every principle and idea and project of Benjamin Netanyahu's, I've never said that he's anything other than a brilliant political operator. We've talked about him here as a magician, a sorcerer, the kind of Houdini of politics who gets out of a hole. But this, you've put your finger on something that is absolutely right about him, which is he would never have done any of that made any of the mistakes that those three all did make. And you're completely right. The common thread is prematurity, is going too early. Sunak had a pretty narrow window. The latest really he could have gone was probably November. But you're right, July the 4th, as you and I speak, election day here, that he didn't have to do that. And the Biden thing is amazing, because that debate, we're going to get into talking about the fallout from that if that had been October, as they normally are, none of this stuff, this talk about dropping him, dumping him, could have happened, because it would have been just fixed. It would have been too late. So I had an old politics tutor at university who used to say, delay is life in politics. Delay is life itself. He understood what Netanyahu understands, which is if you just, as you say, you get to another sundown, and then you've survival.
Just to say, I don't think it's the good strategy if you're a CEO, or if you want to save the planet, or if your kid's doing homework. But this, for politics, might actually be the right idea.
Yeah, there's a reason he's been around longer than any of those other three. I mean, he's obviously younger than Biden, but he's been at the top longer than any of them, and you can see why. As we said, it is election day here, but by the time people hear this, they'll know what we don't know, which is the outcome. That said, unless it is, I think, the biggest political upset ever, we can say that Labour is set to win this election. If they haven't, and if you're hearing this and somehow Sunak is still prime minister, that means the entire polling industry. We are in an upside down world, because every possible measure of the political landscape, every instrument will have been faulty, because it says, the forecasters say, it's not just going to be a win, but a big win for Labour and its leader, Keir Starmer.
So, first of all, on the 4th of July, you of all people, Brits, should know that date is taken. But okay, it's election time. And, a small thing to say about this is that, I've anchored 10 election night broadcasts here in Israel. Nothing makes me feel better than watching someone else anchoring an election night broadcast in a different country. I love doing that. So I'm going to look forward to doing that tonight. But look, I've been trying to explain Israeli politics on this podcast for a long time. I'm now going to take a lean back and just ask you some stuff. Is that okay?
That's sure. You knock yourself out.
So let's begin with, I still remember being starting out as a foreign news correspondent in the Israeli Army radio. It was 1997. I remember that labor landslide with Tony Blair and New Labor, and you could feel it was palpable, the way he was captivating his audience, the way, he swept the nation. Not to insult, but this sort of landslide that we're assuming will happen with Sir Keir Starmer, it doesn't seem like a massively enthusiastic a landslide and a vote for him. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're right about that. Completely right. And the polling reflects that this isn't a hugely positive endorsement for Labour. And there was a poll that appeared in just the last day or so, which asked people who are planning to vote Labour what their reasons were. And by a country mile, the number one reason was to remove from power the incumbent Conservative Party, rather than a positive vote for Labour. And in fact, the number that was doing it as a positive vote for Keir Starmer was just 1%. This is not, there was sort of Blair mania. I mean, by the way, I covered that election at the time, and I remember thinking, compared to what I'd seen in the United States, I'd just come from covering the Clinton White House. He was no Bill Clinton, Tony Blair. I mean, he built up his sort of charisma and appeal in office. I mean, he was not a complete natural right at the beginning, but and so there's space for sort of Starmer to grow in office. But no, it's definitely not that. It is about, I wrote a column saying that this could be a punishment election. They don't happen that often, but where the electorate is really all about punishing the incumbent government. And that's not because Rishi Sunak in particular has hurt, or is associated with things that the population hate, but the 14 years, and there have been 5 prime ministers in those 14 years, a lot of people are angry, alienated, poorer. The country is less well run. It feels sort of shabby and on its heels a bit, and that is what people have decided. The verdict they seem set to deliver is to say enough of them, and the vehicle for that is Labour. And that, by the way, just last thing, that is no small thing, because there have been unpopular Conservative governments before that have nevertheless got re-elected because the electorate did not trust Labour as an alternative government. And this time, what Starmer's great achievement has been is in a way to be bland and innocuous and inoffensive enough that people say, yeah, if it's him, fine, no problem.
Yeah, well, we'll get to Rishi Sunak, right, and being that kind of kid when the music stops and he's playing musical chairs and he's the kid without the chair suddenly. It's really not his fault, but he's the last line in that chain. But I do want to ask because, the Keir Starmer comes after the Corbyn affair, and that kind of, everyone's saying he cleaned up labor after the anti-Semitism and things like that. But there's still supporters of Corbyn in the party, and there's still candidates for whom the Corbyn years were sort of a fond memory. So did he indeed succeed in cleaning up the act of the party after Corbyn?
He really did. And one of the things that's fascinating about him, one of the first things I said about him before he was leader, people asked me about him, and, I'd spoken to him a few times, and I said, he's extremely serious about being prime minister. That's the main thing you need to know about him. Not always true, by the way, of opposition leaders or particularly leaders of the Labour Party. I don't think his predecessor was, laser focused on being prime minister. He was, and he understood kind of strategically that was a huge obstacle, not just because Jewish community here is tiny, 250,000 or something. It's not that Jewish votes. He understood that was a signifier for the rest of the country of whether these people were fit for government. That it became a barrier that if they had this problem of anti-Semitism, then obviously they're not fit for government. I encountered that in areas of the country 5 years ago where no Jews lived, but they just understood it as an indicator. And so he set about doing that, and to the point where his predecessor, the previous leader, is no longer a member of his party. He expelled him from Labour. He is standing instead as an independent. And you mentioned those supporters. There are a few, but we are talking a handful. I mean, that sort of Corbynite wing of the party, if they're in double figures, I would be surprised in terms of the number of members of parliament. He has controlled from the centre, angering people who say it's undemocratic, who is allowed to be a Labour candidate, and he has, with ruthless determination, weeded out anyone who is not loyal to him. And he has got a very, very new face. So yes, there are voices on the margins, but they're pretty well on the margins.
But let's say with the Jewish and Israeli question, I mean, Corbyn's problem wasn't only anti-Semitism. He was quite friendly with Hezbollah and Hamas. How many voices, I mean, let's ask this differently. If indeed it is a Labour government, like what do Israelis need to expect? Obviously, Keir Starmer was more centrist on Israel, but you have been hearing voices, I think at the very least, of Labour's candidates talking about an arms boycott. But again, that's at the very least. Like, what kind of thing are we going to hear from this new government? We being Israelis.
Yes. No, I think that's a good distinction, because I think while Keir Starmer has absolutely been, robust and hard-headed on the anti-Semitism question, the Israel question is different. Mm-hmm. And there, historically, Labour, for many decades, actually not always, but for many decades, is very pro-Palestinian. And many decades before that, it was hugely pro-Zionist in the early years, including the left. But as we've charted on the podcast a lot, that has shifted. And so there is deep sympathy for the Palestinians. And Keir Starmer is hugely distrusted by that wing of the party, because right at the beginning, he didn't just say that Israel had a right to defend itself. He went further in comments which, I wouldn't have said, which is on the, very vexed question of humanitarian aid and everything. He said, yeah, if Israel is cutting off supplies of food and water and fuel, they are. And I think it was partly, he later said he worded it wrong, but they are within their rights to do that, he said. And he did have to walk that back later. But it means, just like there are Democrats who call Joe Biden Genocide Joe, there are people who associate Keir Starmer with this dread word, genocide. There are posters of him with blood on his hands and so on. So there's a battle inside his party on that. My in conversations with people at the top of the party suggest it will be very much like the last Labour government. It will be, pro two-state solution. It will be very much in the kind of international consensus. You may see moves and discussion about recognition of a Palestinian state, but framed in the sense of that helps two states. It reminds people we're in favour of two states, not a single Palestinian state. And therefore, that may be where their orientation is. Last thing I'd say, I know Israelis inevitably will be thinking about that. It's not high on the agenda of this new government, if that's what it was.
Don't say it like that. It makes us feel unimportant.
Starmer has a whole lot on his plate before he's going to get to doing stuff on Israel or the Middle East, including even in foreign affairs. There's other issues, the relationship with Europe and so on.
Between the lines, I sense you're not a Tory fan. Maybe it's that latest podcast you did about the damage the Tories did to Britain. If we're on that subject, just in parentheses, all the podcasts you've been doing, man, I mean, just...
it's a lot.
You're not a fan of the Tories, but I do want to ask something that I always found fascinating, which is the sort of huge societal revolutions came from them, just in the sense of who was elected party leader, right? The first female prime minister, and in fact, the second and the third. Well, the third you kind of blinked and you missed her, but you know what I mean. And of course, the first man of color, Rishi Sunak, and I'm not wrong about that, being the first prime minister, all coming from the Conservatives. By the way, to say nothing of, John Major, really blue-collar Brixton, son of a circus manager or something of the sort. Like, all of these things coming from the Conservatives, not from the Labour. How do you explain that?
No, people really do wrestle with that question. And by the way, the question about whether Rishi Sunak the first person of colour, there is an attempt to say that Benjamin Disraeli, who was born a Jew and of, a Sephardi Jew, could he technically count? Famously his father converted him, baptised him when he was 12 or 13 years old. But nevertheless, he too was a Conservative. So you're absolutely right. The Labour have only been led, in terms of full-time leaders, only by white men, and all the kind of diversity has come from the Conservatives. And people do, talk about why that might be, and is it about the fact that Conservatives don't think in terms of communities and groups, but rather about individuals, and therefore the notion of the individual and aspiration who gets on. Maybe that's what it was. And Margaret Thatcher famously was not brilliant as a advancer of women. She appointed hardly any women. She didn't think this is a breakthrough for feminism. Instead, she thought that, people would say the toughest man in the room and all that stuff. And similarly, Rishi Sunak is there as a representative of himself. All that said, it is quite true that they're, and I think this will be part of the, if that's what it is, political obituary for Rishi Sunak. That was a breakthrough. And I think it was very moving for people of colour in this country to see him there at Downing Street. A lot of British Indians joked saying, "You have no idea, Mr. Sunak, the pressure you have now put on all of us, because now it's not going to be enough to be a CEO or a university professor. They're going to say he made it to Prime Minister," which has an echo for all of us. So I think that was significant, and that means Labour still has work to do in that regard.
This is fun. I like it. We should change our whole podcast and just me asking you questions. It takes a lot off me. Finally, the thing about Britain being sort of very different from the world trend, right? If Trump indeed wins and whatever is happening in Europe, the sort of right side of the political map taking over, this is the exact opposite. How would you read that at all? Is it a coincidence or is it something else?
Well, and we're going to come on, aren't we, to talk about France. Yep. And this is definitely the wave. And the first blush, it looks like there's this wave of nationalist populism, Trump accelerating, gaining ground in America. That's what it looks like, with Britain bucking that trend. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, and this is part optimism talking, it's sort of something I both think but more hope, maybe this trend is anti-incumbency. Mm-hmm. It's an anti-status quo trend. And the incumbent status quo in this country since 2010 has been the right, and therefore the country is turning centre-left. And, there were signs in those European parliamentary elections. There were setbacks for Orban. You think about the change of government in Poland, where the nationalist populist option was booted out and a return to the kind of liberal centrist Donald Tusk. So maybe that's what we're witnessing. This is a very bad time to be incumbents. And by the way, that's a warning, because if it is Keir Starmer, you're hearing, who's Prime Minister when you hear this, people say, look, he will be the incumbent and maybe he'll be vulnerable next time. That we're in a period of volatility where and sort of single term governments. Trump is there for 4 years. He's kicked out. Biden appears to be on notice after 4 years. Maybe that's the period we're in, where people are unhappy with the status quo, in which case Britain is not bucking the trend, it's part of the trend. Anyway, enough about Britain, whose election is now in the rearview mirror, and more about the one that is looming. Thanks to Netanyahu's philosophy of delay, there is no prospect of one in Israel, but instead there is the date in the calendar, November the 5th. A very good friend of mine put a bet on New Year's Day of this year, saying the two candidates would not be Trump and Biden. One of them wouldn't be there. And for a long time, I thought that bet was not looking so good. It's looking stronger now with this pressure on Biden, fascinating disconnect between what is said privately and what's being said publicly. Publicly, most Democrats lining up behind him and saying he's our nominee. But between the lines, and definitely privately, and I'm sure we've both been hearing this from people, Democrats and others in the States, there is a real sort of crumbling of, or eroding, perhaps is a better word, of support for Joe Biden just after that absolutely cataclysmically awful debate, which you and I both followed in real time in the middle of the night. It was a disaster, and Democrats are panicking. Yeah,
panicking is an understatement. First of all, to me, the conversation about who will decide, right? Will it be Jill Biden? Would it be Hunter Biden? Will it be Joe Biden? The group that's going to decide this is not the Bidens, it's the donors. And if the donors figure out, they're still waiting, by the way, right, to see if this can be somehow salvaged, somehow to convince Americans, listen, it was a terrible night, we realize that, but the president is still, his cognitive abilities are fine, and he's a good president, and let him stay the course. The donors have to decide here. And the fact that the Biden campaign did publish right this weekend, right after the debate, he managed to have to get $38 million from his donors is important for him. But at the end of the day, if he's going to look at the bank account and see there's no money there, that is when I think the change might happen. I mean, look, it could be that on Thursday night, right, we witness the most consequential television debate in history. We have, for years been discussing, did George Bush Sr. lose because he looked at his watch during a debate? Did Carter lose because he was talking about his daughter Amy and nuclear weapons? Did, Nixon lose because he was unshaved? No. It is possible that because of a television debate, the president of the United States will step down in the final months of a race. I mean, that's almost unthinkable. I was thinking about this a few days ago. I interviewed Biden 2 years ago, actually July 2 years ago. He was, and it was pretty close to 4 o'clock, by the way. He was very sharp. He was on point. There was no teleprompter. We spoke for a while. You had no feeling like this man is not, focused. I realized that 2 years in an 80-year-old man's life is a lot. But, I mean, I still think that they are making this attempt at convincing Americans. By the way, the more powerful Trump feels, the more mistakes he's making. He's becoming more and more Trumpian. So you have that video coming out of him talking terribly about Biden and about Kamala Harris. So I still think there's a way to fix this. Perhaps it's very late. Obviously, the biggest sin a man can make is that he's old. I mean, isn't that what we've learned this week? You can do all kinds of things like pay hush money to porn stars, but don't be old. And definitely don't lie about your abilities. That is something that should be said, right? That somehow the biggest sin is that.
Completely right. I mean, the defense of that obsession with the age would be not that it is actually a greater sin, but because of how incapacitated he seemed in that debate, he wasn't able to press and prosecute the case against Donald Trump. So, of course, Donald Trump's crimes, literally, are much more serious. But Joe Biden, in the condition he's now in, isn't able to advance that argument. And of course, all this has become so much more serious because of this week's decision by the Supreme Court, essentially granting blanket immunity to any official act that a future president, and it seems almost clear who they've got in mind, any action a future president might take, even actually some of their unofficial activity, it's going to be very hard to prosecute. So people are properly anxious that a autocratic regime is conceivable in the United States, and therefore you need someone who absolutely prevents Donald Trump getting his hands on that power, and they do not feel, and I don't think anyone can feel, confident that Joe Biden is that person. I think your testimony from 2 years ago, your own interview with him, is so relevant because a couple of White House officials, former White House officials, have stepped forward to say similar things, that they remembered him being absolutely on the ball. And then they go, mind you, I did leave the White House 20 months ago, or I left at the end of 2022 or whatever. And I think a lot of the reporting that's come out this week suggests the decline has been quite precipitate, and it's come in these last few months. And I think that is a change. As so often, Nancy Pelosi, who I think is a brilliant political operator, also not young, by the way, I think she's over 80, she said that the key question is, was this a moment, or is it a condition? Was it a bad night, or is this a condition? And that's the key question, I think. And if it is a condition, I think it's he has to go. Your point about donors, by the way, I do wonder about that. Just because there's some $140 million already in the war chest, there will be federal funding once he is the official nominee, and I always, think there will be some donors who just will stand by him to the end. If he really doesn't want to go, it's really quite hard to get him out. The other figure I think people should watch is Jim Clyburn, Congressman of South Carolina, who played a crucial role in 2020 in getting the nomination for Biden. His endorsement has felt conditional to me. It's not, he said he's got one strike, two more swings of the bat. I mean, this was strike one, he's got two more. I don't know. If Clyburn goes, I think that is probably curtains for Biden, but we'll see.
Look, we are watching a Shakespearean tragedy in front of our eyes, a real life one, right? It's kind of King Lear and Macbeth all rolled into one. And these are such complicated questions. How do you dismantle a Biden candidacy without dismantling the Biden presidency? Because you're saying, wait a minute, he can't be the candidate, but he can be the president for another 7 months. This is incredibly complicated. I would just throw in, if I may, as an Israeli, I think that we must say, we Israelis, we have to remember, right, that this a man, when Israel was under an existential threat, he stood by us, and he's standing by us, right? He said to Israel's enemies, don't. He came here during the war. He authorized billions of dollars in weapons to Israel. He helped Israel prevent an Iranian attack. He met with Israeli-American hostages. I mean, we need to remember that. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism from the American right about the Biden administration and vis-a-vis Israel, and there's a lot of criticism from the Israeli right. But we must not forget, and this wasn't a decade ago, it wasn't even 2 years ago, it was this year. So these are just my 2 shekels in this conversation. I think it's an important thing to say when we are discussing if he's stepping down and who might replace him.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Hugely consequential presidency, much more than people expected. You've listed all the achievements in one area, but there are many domestically as well. Massively consequential presidency. I don't think the question is, has his presidency been good? The question is, does he have what it takes almost physically and mentally to win a second term? And that is, unfortunately for him, a very, very different question.
You know, it's been a while and we didn't talk about Israel. That is very strange. Don't you
I think it might be a record for us, actually, to have gone this long. But we touched on it a little bit, didn't we?
Yeah, we did mention Benjamin Netanyahu.
We made
right
Keir Starmer about Israel. We made Biden about Israel. So we can always...
My conscience is clean about this. Okay. Yeah. So it is very hard to believe, but almost at the 9-month mark since October 7th and the war in Gaza. The main news this week really is that there might, after the first deal in November, there might finally be progress on another hostage deal. Now, what essentially happened, the drama of the last sort of 24 hours is that an Israeli official is saying that Hamas, for the first time, isn't insisting on a complete ceasefire in the first stage of the deal. So essentially, Hamas is agreeing to the Biden plan for releasing hostages. What is very interesting is what is happening internally in Israel, because a few days ago, it was Bezalel Smotrich, the most far-right minister in Netanyahu's government, coming out and saying there is a chance that Hamas might agree to the deal, which sounded a little bit weird that he was the one saying it. And then the story following that was that people around the negotiation are actually blaming Netanyahu for trying to sabotage and using Smotrich as this sort of face of trying to sabotage the deal. We will remind our listeners that Ben Gvir and Smotrich are against a deal. In fact, Ben Gvir himself voted against the first hostage deal, meaning that he didn't want the 80 or more Israelis, mothers, children, and others to come home. But there is a prominent part of the Israeli society, not the majority in any way, but that thinks that this is the wrong thing to do, ending the war is wrong, giving Hamas this, what they call a reward, and saying, okay, you can kidnap Israelis in the future as much as you want, because you will always have this option of a deal. So Smotrich and Ben Gvir are against it. They are very powerful in Netanyahu's government. In fact, they hold the fate of the government in their hands. So the thinking of many of Netanyahu's opponents, the majority who want a deal, is that Netanyahu is sabotaging this to, we've talked about it this many times for his government to survive. By the way, the underlining theme of this episode: elections are important. So that is what is happening. I have to tell you that every newspaper in Israel today had a paid ad. The first page of the newspaper is of a book coming out of hostages' families blaming Netanyahu for abandoning the hostages. So this is a step up from the protest of the families thus far.
You sent me a text just before we spoke with a picture of that front page. It's very powerful because it's sort of spoofed to look like a promo for his own book, because he did write his own memoir recently. And instead there's that word abandonment again, which we know has been a word used by the hostage families. It's a direct accusation. It is still, I know I've said it before, it's still, to my mind, extraordinary that he remains in place, as you say, a full 9 months after October 7th, that he's managed to fend off that reckoning and also the reckoning of a proper commission of inquiry. Blink and it will be a year since this thing happened, and the evidence trail gets colder. I mean, I just think we have to almost remind ourselves of the enormity of that. And what's so odd is there is a kind of settled will. There's a consensus in the country that he shouldn't be in that job. A poll saying 66% think he should leave office. So that disconnect, when the public think this, but nothing happens, is one of the oddnesses of oddities of this situation.
So first of all, it was a poll on Channel 12, Jonathan, and secondly, I think it's important to ask why. Then I think that is what you're actually asking. Why is the protest movement against Netanyahu not more powerful? Okay, we see more and more people in the streets, in the 100,000s perhaps, but not a million, not more than a million. Why is it when you have that figure of 66% think he should, not remain in office? I think the reason for that is that Israelis are still traumatized. They are still, many of them, in survival mode. Remember, there are tens of thousands of Israelis who have been displaced in the north and in the south. People who are really concerned about the economy and what's going to happen to their lives, and they're really in survival mode. They don't feel like they have that ability to go to protest. So I think that you're seeing, again, this kind of disconnect between what many feel and what they're actually doing. Again, we are very close to the end of July. We keep saying that date, but it's important. If Netanyahu survives by the end of the Knesset session, 28th of July, he's flying to DC on the 22nd. If he survives, that means the next time there's a Knesset session and it's easier to topple the government, that's the end of October. So we just have to keep that in mind.
That trip to DC, extraordinary to think that Netanyahu, might still be in his job, and conceivably Joe Biden might not. I mean, the idea of that would have seemed science fiction before. But just in terms of the election fever everywhere, that's another thing that has helped Netanyahu internationally, because the focus has been away from what's going on the ground. A few months ago, there would have been huge international attention on, for example, these further evacuations of Palestinians out of population centres in Gaza, including Khan Yunis. Gazans warned to leave in advance of Israeli military action. Or, and we mentioned him, Bezalel Smotrich, and his announcement that Israel's civil administration had designated nearly 3,000 acres of the West Bank as state land, a huge grab. And Smotrich saying, thank God we are building and developing the settlements and thwarting the danger of a Palestinian state. In normal times, that would have brought big international reaction from Paris, from London, from Washington. All three of those places are massively distracted at the moment. And therefore, given their position internationally is a two-state solution, which includes a Palestinian state, the finance minister, senior minister of the Israeli government saying, we are thwarting that possibility, that would normally bring a response. But instead, everybody in those big capitals is preoccupied, and elsewhere in the world too. And that's another reason why Netanyahu's playing it long does benefit him.
So for a long time, we've been wanting to talk about the French Jewish community, which is the third largest community in the world. Memo to the British Jews, you got work to do. But we want to talk about the community, and obviously the fact that we are right after the first round of parliamentary elections with the result that Marine Le Pen brought with her party. And just before the second round, we thought that was a good opportunity to talk about that community.
Very much so, because they are, in a way, caught in between this polarization that's happened in France, the far right with its history, Le Pen, a history of anti-Semitism. On the other hand, you have a far left who are, militant on the issue of Israel and often insensitive or worse to questions of anti-Semitism. And there in the middle is this community numbering around the 500,000 mark. So we thought it now was absolutely the right moment to speak to one of the leading voices in the French media, but also a leading French Jewish voice.
Ruth Elkrief is a journalist, a star on French television for over 30 years. She's been the anchor of the news. She's an analyst and hosts a weekly interview program on LCI, and most recently had to have security detail because of being targeted by far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Ruth, we're so glad to have you on Unholy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you.
We're having this conversation right before the second round of the French parliamentary elections. After the first round, Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally and its allies won the largest proportion of seats. What is the chance that this will happen and that for the first time in French history, we're going to witness the far-right having an absolute majority in the National Assembly?
After the first round, it was possible that this far-right party won the election. Since the beginning of the second week, now in the between, there were some alliances between all the rest of the parties to make a sort of barrage. It's everyone together against this party. So a lot of candidates got out to let the other ones just in front of the far-right party, which is giving the best chance to the anti-Rassemblement National to win next week. So today we can almost say that they won't be able to have an absolute majority in the parliament. Of course, it's not already done, and we have to wait, of course, to the election and to be cautious because now the French electors don't obey like this to the parties in Paris, and we can see it every day. So we have to be cautious, but they have a lot less chances to have the absolute majority, but they can, and it's almost sure that they will be the first ones in the parliament. So now, anyway, we're going ahead a totally unknown situation in France, and a lot of people are very anxious, and this dissolution has provoked a lot of anxiety and stress in a big part of the population.
So let's talk about that anxiety and stress and what exactly it is that people fear. Because the name Le Pen, people remember absolutely when it was Jean-Marie Le Pen, when everyone had to unite to block him in that presidential contest against Jacques Chirac. That they knew because Le Pen was understood as basically a fascist figure. Now it's 20 more years that have passed. It's not Jean-Marie Le Pen, it's his daughter, Marine Le Pen, and in a way not even her, it's this other younger man as the leader. What are people frightened of, and in a way are they right to be frightened? What is it you think they would do if they did have power?
It's called now more a national populist party than an extreme right fascist party, and it's more like Viktor Orban party or Giorgia Meloni, but there are some differences, of course. It's more subtle and more specific French. The people are afraid because, first of all, it's a xenophobic party. And since they began to be a possibility of majority, there are some racist acts, some incidents in France, of course. And also the stress is because they never had the power, and a lot of observers like me, analysts like me, think that they are not in capacity to exert the power in such a situation in Europe with the war at our doors. And it depends. Of course, the left and the extreme left say they are fascists and it's coming to be a terrible thing. But as an analyst, I wouldn't say that. I would say that it's a national populist party with a risk of illiberal power in some time, and of course an incompetence and not capacity of inability of being at power today, which is different, okay? But moreover, it's anxiety about the economical situation, because we would have all the markets against us because they are not liable. It's also this question which is terrible. They want to not to get out of Europe, of course, of EU, but they will say a lot of things that will put us in the margins of Europe, which is incredible for France.
Is that, though, because of this distinction, and you see this difference in a lot of the right-wing parties in Europe, which is they are very positive about Israel, partly because their issue is with Muslims, and they know that Muslims line up against Israel, so they take up the side of Israel, even as at the same time they're not that positive about Jews. And we can see this in Orban and Italy and other places.
It's very new because the Jewish community is also anxious because this party has a terrible history on this question of anti-Semitism. It's absolutely sure. But these last years, and specifically since the 7th of October, this party has been okay on this question. And it's so hard these last months on this question. It's so hard for the French Jewish, in any way they feel their Judaism, because there was such a big wave of anti-Semitism. And we have to say that this party has been okay on the 7th of October. Marine Le Pen spoke about pogrom in the National Assembly. And she said Hamas is terrorist. And she said we have to protect the French Jewish people. The history of the Marine Le Pen party is terrible. But the present of this party is okay.
You know, we have to ask about the Jewish community that you are part of. And of course, it seems like this party is trying to whitewash its anti-Semitist past. I think in a way also you tell us. But obviously present, there are still these stories being exposed. Right now, there was a story of just recently a photo of a candidate posing with the cap of the Waffen-SS. You know, you have all of these stories about the people around either Jordan Bardella, the president of the party, or around Marine Le Pen herself. So how concerned should the Jewish community be when looking at this phenomenon of Marine Le Pen and her party?
Yes, you're right. But I have to say, and as an analyst, I have to acknowledge that Marine Le Pen broke up with her father, who was really anti-Semitic, before the events of the 7th of October. And she already before analyzed that the anti-Semitism is a problem for her party. And as a person, I would not say that she's anti-Semitic, okay? And I have to be honest on this question. That doesn't mean that she doesn't have this past, and there's a lot of candidates and a lot of electors are not clean on this question. But she made some gestures, and it's a testimony of her honesty, personal honesty on this question. But she has around her very bad people, very sulfurous people on this question, and we cannot trust her. Not her personally, but her party, we cannot trust it. So it's difficult. It's difficult because you have some French Jewish who are very attracted by this party today. And a lot of others tell them, please don't fall in this trap. But we have this question because they have been really okay, and it has been such a terrible time that naturally you can feel that people want to be protected, and it's a natural feeling. You cannot reproach them with that, and it's a simple and natural feeling. But the community, the French officials of the community are very clear, and they say no Marine Le Pen and no Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And they help us to be clear on this question.
So you mentioned Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and we'll get into your personal run-in with him in a minute. But he's the other side of the aisle, the extreme left, a man that says the anti-Semitism in France is sporadic. Some of his own party members praised Hamas after the 7th of October. I kind of want to ask you, maybe this is an unfair question, what is worse for French Jews? Him, the extreme left, or the extreme right?
We don't want to choose. I mean, it's my personal position and a lot of friends of mine, and also the position of the officials of the French community. We are Republican, we are French, and the French Republic protects us, and we don't trust any of these two extreme parties. That's it. And it's terrible to be in this situation because we feel alone in this situation and we don't have to be on this choice. But we can't say that the French Jewish will vote for Marine Le Pen. But they are really, on the other side, angry and anxious and really fearing Mélenchon and his friends. And it's a very concrete and immediate threat. And this is the problem. It's a sort of, which is the most close threat between and the most immediate or the most far threat. And of course, the question of the Mélenchon party is really hard and terrible for the French Jewish today.
I was just thinking in those places where there are only, it's a binary choice. But Yonit mentioned your own situation with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and we've mentioned it a couple of times without telling people what happened. So can you share with us what exactly happened between him and you?
It's a very bizarre guy who has been in the past pretty close of the Jewish people and who has totally changed because he's not only a cynical leader, he's also an ex-Trotskyist guy who is very clever in political strategy, and he has a project to convince all the French Muslims to vote for him. But he makes it in a very terrible way because, of course, the French Muslims have every right to vote for anyone, but not on the basis of being Muslim, but on the basis of being a French citizen, as a Republican citizen. And it's my reproach to him each time I made interviews. And I accused him of communitarism. And I accused him of being not Republican on his way of speaking to the Muslim community, stressing on their religion instead of speaking to French citizens. And after came the 7th of October, and on some interviews, I also contested, didn't accept the term of genocide. And he made a tweet saying that I was Islamophobic. And in the hours after this tweet, I received the threats, and the French Minister of Interior decided to put me under policy protection. And I received threats of to both sides, which was interesting, because there is also a sort of meeting point between the certain extreme right, not Marine Le Pen directly, but more far ultra-right, and they meet with Islamist people. So I've been under protection for some weeks, but it was the third time in my journalist life. It began in after the attacks of 2015 in Paris. I've been threatened by Daesh, and I've been under protection for 8 months. And after the killing of Samuel Paty, I've been under protection also because I've been threatened too. So it's a sort of common situation now for a lot of journalists in France. and we live with this. It's not very nice. It's not nice for our families, for sure. But we don't have to think about that. We don't have to because if you think about that, you don't speak and you don't work correctly. So you have to live with it.
Yeah. I saw, by the way, in one of your interviews, you said October 7th made you come out as Jewish, although you carry the name Ruth Elkrief, so I assume, this was a known fact. Tell us a little bit about what October 7th did to you, personally and on a professional level.
Actually, I was for many years an interviewer, so I was on a situation to be a sort of poker face about a face of my guests. But I became a columnist, and I choose to be columnist on the beginning of this year, and I'm 63. So that means that my career is not ahead. So it's a sort of freedom. It's a great freedom. And of course, the events of the 7th of October made a terrible historical situation. And I can tell you, I've been lucky to be a columnist on this time because I could make my coming out, which is, I don't find another word. And for the first time of my professional life, I told on the air what was my personal history. I came in France 50 years ago after the Kippur War from Morocco. And when I came in France, I was 13, and I thought and I felt France is the country where Jewish will be safe for forever. And I said on the air, but now, 50 years after, I'm afraid, not only for me, but for all the Jewish people, because it was the 9th of October when I said that on the air, because it was we could already feel that anti-Semitism will come back. And yes, during these last months, I spoke about anti-Semitism, I spoke about the hostages, I spoke about, and I wouldn't have done the same for many years before.
Now,
which is not easy because I receive a lot of reactions, and I'm classified now like a Zionist or something. I don't care. I'm a French Republican citizen and journalist, committed on the values of freedom, of equality, and of secularism. And on these values, I do my job. And these are not a question of Jewish or not Jewish. I'm a French Republican citizen. And because on these values, I can speak of the hostages, about the hostages, or about anti-Semitism, or about the war in Gaza. And I'm free of speaking about all this.
Ruth Elkrief, it was fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for your perspective, and thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, exactly as we had wanted to get that perspective on what is such a fascinating story, but not an easy one at all for that community. It's not quite between a rock and a hard place, but it's somewhere in that zone, and they are having to make some very big decisions. A lot of French Jews wrestling with that dilemma this weekend.
Yeah, between a hard place and a hard place. Ruth Elkrief, really just such a prominent journalist before anything else, and the way that she talked to us about how she decided to become an analyst and to have, to editorialize, and after so many years of being the sort of objective anchor woman, I can relate to that a little bit, but she came out, so to speak, with quotations as being Jewish and what that meant for her. I thought that was a fascinating conversation.
Yes, I thought she was talking to you, TV anchorwoman to TV anchorwoman, when she said it gives you great freedom, but she's further down that road than you are. She's been doing French TV even longer than you've been on Israeli TV. But that's interesting that she felt it was very freeing to voice her own opinions. And we're glad that she did that with us on Unholy. So there's a kind of British flavour to our awards this week, perhaps fitting because it's Big News Day and a big news week here. For our Chutzpah Award, I thought we would mention the Glastonbury Festival. Huge music festival, I think the biggest in Europe. More than one, quite a few. Jewish festival goers were disappointed by how the festival handled this in a couple of ways. The first thing is, obviously, in a lot of people's minds, is the Nova Music Festival, which is where October 7th struck first, and with lethal, devastating consequences, hundreds killed there. And I think there was an expectation that some of the musicians might mention that and might talk about that. That those killed at Nova were just like you, people, there at Glastonbury. That didn't happen. There was a nod from Chris Martin of Coldplay, who said we're thinking about the people in Israel and Palestine. That was it, and I think there was some disappointment about that, but also disappointment about this. It's a seemingly small thing, but there is one part of Glastonbury, it's a huge sprawling festival. It's not just few music stages. There's all these areas that almost form little neighborhoods. There's one that's done up to look like downtown New York, with the sort of creation of like fake streets. And part of that was always a, fake front for a kosher sausage outlet, M. Levine and Sons, I think. And part of the logo for that, part of the shop sign, was 2 blue Stars of David. People noticed that when they went back to that neighborhood this time, still M. Levine, but the Stars of David have been sort of brushed out. Now, I'm guessing that whoever did that thought, oh, they're blue, people will think it's pro-Israel, we mustn't do that. But the literally erasing of the Jewish presence at Glastonbury, coupled with the failure to in any way commemorate those killed at the Nova Music Festival, I think made people feel, well, in a way, back to that phrase, David Baddiel, Jews don't count, but sort of just somehow that their dead have been forgotten. And I think that provided a sour note for those Jews who go to Glastonbury and otherwise, love it.
I mean, it was heartbreaking, to be honest. 364 Israelis and others, music goers, were murdered at the Nova Festival. 44 were abducted, kidnapped into Gaza. How can you do anything but, if this is a music festival, talk about people who just, young people just came to a music festival and that's how they ended their lives? It's heartbreaking, and you look at that and you're if Glastonbury is trying to capture the spirit of Woodstock, then I guess they do that without the peace, love, and the human understanding. But that was just the feeling that a lot of Israelis had this week, for sure. I think you get to do the Mensch as well, by the way, because of your special day, Jonathan.
Ah, good. Okay, so the Mensch Award, I thought we would nominate Sir Keir Starmer. Not just because this is, if the polls are right, a very big day in his life, but rather because of his position on what became, at the last stage of the campaign, a small and in a way kind of pathetic issue, which is he was asked about how he would handle the job, and he said one of the things he would want to do is ring fence one evening a week where he would be with family pretty much come what may, he said. From 6 p.m. onwards, he would want to be with his family, he said, on Friday night. Now, immediately the Conservatives hit back saying, being Prime Minister is not a part-time job. Vladimir Putin's not going to check his diary whether he can invade Ukraine to make sure it's not after 6 o'clock on a Friday night. They went right in. Now, why is it that Keir Starmer ring fences that particular time? It's because Keir Starmer's wife, Vicky, is Jewish, and he has spoken about how they, not always, but often, try and mark Friday night with candles and prayers and so on. His in-laws are Jewish, and this is something he's liked to do, and he's really got into, that thing which, even a lot of Jews are not necessarily perfect on, which is ring fencing a bit of Shabbat, and he's sold on it, and this is what he was really saying. And of course, he wasn't saying he would never pick up the phone. He's not become Haredi. He was saying, rather, this is a bit of family time. And he defended it. He didn't back down. He stayed with it. And I think for his defending his, adapted Shabbat habit means that Keir Starmer and perhaps the Starmer family, our Mensch of the week this week.
Agreed. Look, we're in consensus. I elect to end our show. And
Nicely done.
I think it was quite dense and populated with many elections, but that is the world that we live in this week. We will say our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, and Omri Barak, and we shall meet next week.
See you then.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.